I used to think that the universe had a way of organizing itself into manageable problems, that every equation could be solved if you threw enough brains and machines at it. That's what they told us when we took the job. Vindex 7 was just another challenge, another rock to tame and bend to our will. I never questioned it. The bonuses were too good, the contracts too thick with signatures, and the promise of a fresh start was too much to pass up. We were the company's best team, they said. Engineers, scientists, soldiers, the perfect crew to turn a barren, worthless planet into something fit for human life. What they didn't tell us, what none of us realized until it was too late, was that Vindex 7 wasn't some rock orbiting a star. It wasn't just dirt and minerals waiting for us to terraform it. No, it had its own rules, its own agenda. Looking back now, I see how naive we were. We thought we could force the planet to cooperate, force it to yield to our machines, our formulas. We were wrong, horribly, irreversibly wrong. And by the time we understood what was happening, it had already started pushing back. Quiet at first, like the shifting of sand underfoot. But then it got louder, stronger. I don't know why I'm still here, to be honest. Maybe I should have died with the rest of them. Maybe I should have stayed and fought. But something about Vindex 7 got into me, twisted something inside my head. I can still feel it sometimes, even now, scratching at the edges of my thoughts, like it's waiting for me to come back. And the thing is, I'm starting to think it wasn't us who came here to reshape Vindex 7. Maybe it brought us here to reshape us. The shuttle landed with a thud that reverberated through the floor, the engines gradually quieting as we unbuckled from our seats. Vindex 7 wasn't much to look at, just endless stretches of rock, dust storms kicking up the horizon, and the dim light from a star that probably didn't have more than a few million years left. No vegetation, no water, just a wasteland, waiting for us to do our job. Commander Rex Lawton was already barking orders the second the door opened, his voice crisp and full of that military authority that made him a perfect fit for this kind of mission. He liked control, maybe a little too much. But then again, out here, control was everything. Sure, get your team on those soil samples. Mercer, I want you running diagnostics on the processors. Koenig, check the comms and make sure everything's synced with the orbital station. We're on the clock. I grunted in acknowledgement and headed to the nearest processor module, a large, cylindrical machine buried in the dirt. It was one of the atmosphere generators, our bread and butter. We'd brought 6 of them, enough to start terraforming the planet by changing the air itself, adding the right mix of oxygen and stabilizing the weather. Vindex 7 had everything we needed to make it work. Nitrogen, carbon dioxide, trace gases, all the building blocks. The machines just had to coax them out in the right amounts. In theory, it was all routine. The others were already setting up base camp, unpacking gear, securing the perimeter. I ran through the diagnostics, scanning the outputs as the machine activated. The data looked normal. I stared at the screen a second longer, waiting for a spike or some anomaly, but nothing came. Satisfied, I wiped the dust off my hands and looked around. Claire Shaw, the planetologist, was crouched over a sample of dirt, her face lit by the dull glow of a portable lamp. She had that look, deep in concentration, completely absorbed. She'd been quiet on the ride here, her eyes always scanning the landscape like she was trying to read it, like it had something to say to her. I didn't get it, not then. To me, Vindex 7 was just another dead rock in space. But to Claire, it was a puzzle, and she hated puzzles she couldn't solve. "Anything interesting?" I called out, walking over to where she knelt. She didn't look up. "It's strange." "What's strange?" "The soil. It's too uniform, like it's been filtered or processed somehow. I've never seen anything like it. It's almost as if..." She trailed off, rubbing the dirt between her fingers. I raised an eyebrow. "As if what?" She stood up, brushing her hands off on her suit. "Never mind. It's probably nothing. Just an odd composition." I shrugged and turned back toward the base. Whatever it wasn't our problem. The processors would handle it. That was the beauty of the tech. Didn't matter what the planet threw at us. The machines would adjust. That's what they were built for. Hours passed as we set up the rest of the equipment. By the time night fell, we had everything in place. Atmosphere generators, climate towers, seismic sensors. It was a well-oiled operation, the kind of thing we'd done a dozen times before. By the end of the week, the first phase would be complete, and the planet would begin to feel more like a future home. That's when the first storm hit. It came out of nowhere, no warning, no blips on the scanners, just a massive wall of dust and wind that slammed into the camp, knocking over equipment and sending half the team scrambling for cover. I ducked behind a storage unit, trying to shield my face from the grit that cut through the air like glass shards. Through the chaos, I could see the climate towers buckling under the strain, the generators struggling to keep up. "We didn't predict this!" Koenig shouted through the comms, his voice crackling with static. "This wasn't in any of the readings!" Rex's voice came in cold, controlled. "Stay calm, people. Secure the equipment. Get the generators back online." The storm raged for nearly an hour, a continuous assault that left the camp in disarray. When it finally cleared, we were left staring at the wreckage. Half of the sensors were buried, one of the generators had been torn loose from the ground, and the climate towers were damaged. I stood there, catching my breath, my eyes on the horizon where the storm had disappeared as quickly as it had come. Something didn't sit right. Not the storm itself, that was normal for a planet like this, but the timing, the precision. It was almost like the planet had waited for us to be vulnerable, like it had known exactly when and how to strike. That's when I felt it for the first time. Something in the air, a pressure, like 1,000 unseen eyes bearing down on me. I shook it off, telling myself it was exhaustion, maybe the adrenaline still wearing off, but somewhere, deep in my gut, I knew better. This wasn't a storm, it was a warning. The storm was only the beginning. After that, things started going wrong in ways that didn't add up. The equipment would alternate between states, not like a standard malfunction, but like something was toying with it. The atmosphere generators, usually reliable workhorses, began to act erratically, their outputs fluctuating without reason. The climate towers were the worst, though. We'd repaired them after the storm, or at least we thought we had, but every time we powered them up, the temperature would spike, or the wind patterns would shift violently. Nothing was staying stable. I didn't bring it up at first. Chalked it up to the planet's natural volatility. I'd seen plenty of worlds that didn't behave quite how the simulations predicted. But this felt different. And I wasn't the only one who noticed. Claire kept to herself after that night, constantly poring over data, running samples, studying the planet's surface like she was trying to find the answers written in the rocks. The way she worked, it was like she knew something, but wasn't ready to say it out loud. I didn't push her on it. We all had our own way of coping. Brian, though, he wasn't coping. He'd always been paranoid. Came with the job, I guess, spending too much time in space, isolated from anything that felt normal. But after the storm, he got worse. He stopped trusting the machines, claiming they weren't reading the data right, that something was manipulating the sensors. Rex had no patience for it, but Brian didn't care. He cornered me one evening after I'd finished repairing one of the processors. "It's the planet," he said, his voice low, eyes darting around like he expected something to overhear us. "It's fighting us." I stared at him, wiping grease off my hands. "Fighting us? Brian, it's a planet, not a hostile alien species." No, listen to me," he insisted, stepping closer. "You've seen it, haven't you? The storms, the malfunctions, none of this is random. It's too precise. It's like it knows what we're doing, and it's pushing back. The more we try to change it, the worse it gets." I looked at him, trying to keep my expression neutral. "You're overthinking it. We've run into setbacks, sure, but we can handle it. We've got the equipment." "The equipment isn't working," he snapped, cutting me off. "Don't you get it? It's not going to work, no matter what we do. The planet's not going to let us." That hit me harder than I expected. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but part of me was already thinking the same thing. There was no logical explanation for the way the climate towers kept failing or the generator's odd fluctuations. And then there was that feeling, the pressure, like we were being evaluated by something too vast and too old for us to understand. But I couldn't let that fear take root. I shook my head. "You're imagining things. We'll get through this. Just keep doing your job." He stared at me for a long while, then muttered something before walking away. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I already had enough voices in my head. Days passed, and the situation deteriorated further. The storm that hit us was only the first of many. They came without warning, each one more violent than the last, tearing apart our equipment and forcing us to work around the clock to make repairs. But no matter how fast we fixed things, something always went wrong. It wasn't just the storms either. The ground itself seemed to shift beneath our feet. Seismic activity that shouldn't have been there. Tremors that weren't registered by any of our scanners. Entire sections of the camp started sinking or cracking, making it feel like the planet was swallowing us alive, piece by piece. Claire finally came to me one evening. She held a tablet with her latest findings, but I could tell by the look in her eyes that it wasn't good news. "I think Brian is right," she said quietly. That stopped me cold. Claire was the most rational person on the crew, the last one I expected to back up any of Brian's paranoia, but she wasn't joking. She handed me the tablet, and I skimmed through the data. It didn't make sense. Atmospheric shifts that defied every model, weather patterns that seemed to react to the placement of our equipment. But the worst part was the geological scans. She'd been running deep surface scans ever since the first storm, and what she'd found, it wasn't natural. The planet's crust, its core, all of it. It was in constant flux, changing in ways that couldn't be explained by tectonic activity alone. It was almost like it was alive. "You're saying this planet is conscious?" I asked, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's behaving like something alive, like something that's aware of us, and it's resisting us, Nathan. Every time we try to change it, it fights back." I shook my head, pacing the small space of the base camp. "That's impossible. Even if the planet had some kind of ecosystem we didn't detect, it wouldn't be sentient." "I know how it sounds," she said, stepping closer. "But look at the data. It's not just reacting randomly. There's a pattern. It's intentional." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was jumping to conclusions. But I couldn't. The data didn't lie. And deep down, I'd already started to feel it myself, like the planet was waiting for us to slip up. I didn't have time to process any of it before Rex came storming into the room, his face flushed with frustration. He'd been having problems of his own. His attempts to get the generators working again had been met with nothing but failure, and he wasn't in the mood for any more setbacks. "What the hell is going on here?" he barked, glaring at both of us. "Why isn't the terraforming process back on track?" I glanced at Claire, who stood rigid, clutching her tablet like a shield. "We've got a problem," I said. "The planet, it's not acting like we expected." Rex snorted, crossing his arms. "Yeah, no shit. The storms, the equipment failures, I've seen it all. What I haven't seen is a solution. So what are you going to do about it?" Claire spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Rex, I think we need to stop. We're making things worse." He laughed. "Stop? Are you kidding me? We're on a deadline, sure. We can't just stop because the weather got a little rough." "It's more than that," she insisted. "The planet, I don't care about your theories," Rex interrupted, his voice rising. "We were sent here to do a job, and we're going to finish it. End of discussion." He turned to leave, but I grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at me. "Rex, listen. This isn't just bad weather or faulty equipment. Something is wrong with this planet. If we keep pushing, it's going to push back harder." Rex yanked his arm free, his eyes blazing with anger. "We're in control here, Mercer, not the planet. You either get on board, or you get the hell out of my way." I watched him storm off, my insides twisting at the impact of what he'd said. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that we could regain control, that the machines could overpower whatever force was working against us. But in that moment, I knew we were already past the point of no return. The planet was fighting back, learning how to counter everything we threw at it, and it wasn't going to stop. Neither, it seemed, was Rex. The first thing that went wrong the next day was the generator. It just stopped working. No warning, no error code, nothing. The display was blank, the diagnostics unresponsive. I stood there staring at it, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing fit. It wasn't a simple mechanical issue. It was as if something had deliberately shut it down, disconnected it from reality. I glanced at the horizon, the dusty orange sky heavy with clouds, and felt that pressure again. Rex was furious, of course. He stomped over to the generator, barking orders, demanding answers. I ran through the checklist, double-checked the connections, but it all led to the same conclusion. The generator was dead. Not broken, dead. I could almost feel it, like the planet had drained the life right out of it. Claire stood a few feet away, her eyes locked on the ground. She wasn't surprised. Neither was I, if I was being honest. Brian wasn't doing well either. He'd taken to muttering to himself, his eyes constantly darting around like he was expecting something to come out of the ground and grab him. He'd stopped sleeping, the dark circles under his eyes growing deeper each day. He wasn't wrong, though. Something was out there. Or maybe it was in here, with us, in our heads, twisting our thoughts, turning us against each other. It didn't take long for Rex to start blaming Brian. He called him a liability, said his paranoia was affecting morale, that he was making things worse. Brian didn't take it well. He shouted back, his voice cracking, saying that Rex was blind, that he was putting everyone in danger by ignoring what was happening. I tried to step in, tried to calm them down, but it was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The anger, the fear, it was all boiling over, and I could see it in Rex's eyes. He wanted control, needed it, and Brian was a threat to that. Things came to a head that night. It was late, the camp quiet except for the noise of the remaining equipment. I was in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to shut out the thoughts that kept circling in my head, thoughts that didn't feel entirely like my own. The pressure was there too, making it hard to breathe. I closed my eyes, trying to push it away, but then I heard the shouting. I jumped up, rushing down the corridor of the main habitat module. The shouting grew louder as I reached the control room, a cramped space filled with consoles. Rex and Brian were there, their voices echoing off the walls. Brian was holding one of the data tablets and waving it in Rex's face, shouting about the readings, about the planet, about how we needed to leave before it was too late. Rex wasn't listening. His face was twisted with anger, his hands clenched into fists. "Put it down, Brian," Rex growled, taking a step closer. "You're losing it. You're going to get us all killed." Brian shook his head, backing away, his back hitting the edge of a console. "No, you don't understand. It's already happening. It's in our heads, Rex. It's controlling us. We have to stop." Rex jumped at him, grabbing the tablet, and Brian fought back, shoving him away. The two of them struggled, their movements clumsy and desperate in the confined space. And then suddenly, it was over. Rex pushed Brian hard, and he fell back, his head striking the edge of a metal console. Then silence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Brian lay there, his eyes open, blood pooling beneath his head. Rex stood over him, his face blank. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Rex turned to me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Fear. Real, raw fear. "It was an accident," he said. "He was going to ruin everything. He trailed off, his eyes darting to the walls. "We can't let this stop us. We have to finish the mission. We owe it to everyone back home." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring at Brian's body, at the blood that was slowly pooling across the floor. The air felt heavy, like the planet was waiting to see what we would do next. The rest of the crew found out soon enough. Claire's face went pale when she saw Brian, her hands trembling as she knelt beside him, checking for a pulse that wasn't there. She looked up at Rex, her eyes filled with something between horror and disgust. "This has to stop," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now, before more people die." Rex shook his head. "We're not leaving, we're finishing this. Brian was compromised. He wasn't thinking straight." "Compromised?" Claire repeated, her voice rising. "He was scared, Rex. We're all scared. This planet is—" "It doesn't matter," Rex snapped, cutting her off. "We have a job to do. We're not abandoning it because of some fear. We're stronger than this." But we weren't. I could see it in Claire's eyes, in the way the rest of the crew avoided looking at each other, their faces drawn. The fear was taking root, spreading like a sickness, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. The planet was winning, and we were falling apart. In the following days, we tried to keep working and focus on the mission, but it felt pointless. The generators kept failing, the climate towers refused to stabilize, and every time we fixed one thing, two more broke. Rex grew more and more desperate, pushing us harder, demanding that we work through the exhaustion, through the fear. He was obsessed, convinced that if we just kept going, if we just tried harder, we could force the planet to bend to our will. But it wasn't working. Nothing was working. Claire came to me one night, her face gaunt. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her hands shaking as she handed me a data chip. "What's this?" I asked, taking it from her. "It's everything," she said. "All the data, the scans, the readings, everything I've been working on. I need you to see it, Nathan. I need you to understand." I plugged the chip into my tablet, scrolling through the data. It was all there. The atmospheric shifts, the seismic anomalies, the patterns that weren't random but deliberate. And then there were the scans. Deep scans of the planet's core, showing something moving, shifting. I looked up at her, my stomach twisting. "You really think it's conscious?" She nodded. "I don't think it, Nathan. I know it. It's trying to protect itself, and if we keep pushing, it's going to push back even harder. Rex isn't going to listen. He's too far gone." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "That's why we have to stop him, before it's too late." I didn't know what to say. Part of me still wanted to believe that we could fix this, that we could complete the mission and leave this place behind. But another part of me knew that Claire was right. The planet was alive, and it wasn't going to let us win, not without a fight. The next morning, Rex announced that we were going to initiate the final phase of the terraforming process. It was reckless, dangerous, and every single one of us knew it. Claire tried to argue, tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He was too far gone, his eyes filled with a manic determination that scared me more than anything the planet had thrown at us. As we gathered around the main control console, the air felt heavy, like the planet was bearing down on us, waiting to see what we would do. Claire stood beside me, her eyes locked on Rex as he began the sequence to initiate the final phase. I knew what I had to do. I knew that if I didn't stop him, we were all going to die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The planet was too strong, too determined, and it wasn't going to let us destroy it. "Rex, stop, you can't do this." He didn't even look at me. "Get back in line, Mercer." "No," I said, louder this time. "If you do this, we're all dead. The planet is nothing," he shouted, finally turning to face me, his eyes wild. "We're in control here, not it. We can do this, we have to." I shook my head. "We're not in control, Rex. We never were." He charged at me, his hands reaching for my throat, but I was ready. I sidestepped, grabbing a wrench from the console and swung it, hard. It connected with the side of his head, and he crumpled to the ground, his body limp. I stood there, panting heavily. The rest of the crew was silent, their eyes wide with shock, with fear. I could feel the question hanging in the air. What now? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't stay here. The planet was alive, and it wasn't going to stop until we were gone, one way or another. I looked down at Rex's body lying crumpled on the floor. Blood trickled from the wound I'd given him, spreading slowly into a dark pool around him. For a moment, I expected the planet to react, but nothing happened. The planet didn't care about Rex. It cared about what we were doing, about our machines, our intrusion. "We need to go," I finally said. "We need to get to the shuttle and leave." Claire was the first to speak. "Do you think it'll let us go?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but staying wasn't an option, and we had no more time for debate. "We shut down everything, we leave the equipment, and we go." Sarah, one of the engineers, nodded slowly. She knew, just like the rest of us, that we were out of options. The planet had made that much clear. We gathered what little supplies we could carry and made our way toward the shuttle. I kept expecting something to happen. A tremor, a storm, some new, unimaginable threat. But nothing came. Claire walked beside me. "I think it's watching us," she said softly. "It knows we're leaving." As we reached the shuttle, I glanced back at the base camp. The machines we'd set up, the terraformers, the climate towers, all of it, were still standing. But there was something different about them now. They looked abandoned, like remnants of a failed experiment, like they didn't belong here. Like we didn't belong here. I hoped leaving them behind would be enough. "Everything's ready," Sarah said, her voice strained but functional. "We just need to get inside." I led the way, pulling open the shuttle hatch. One by one, we climbed inside. It should have felt safe, secure, but all I could think about was how we were leaving this place, this living thing behind us, and how much we didn't understand. I exhaled a shaky breath. We were in orbit now, the planet shrinking behind us, nothing but a distant memory. "Are we safe?" Claire asked, her voice quiet, uncertain. I looked down at the planet below, at Vindex 7, a speck of dust in the infinite black. It was quiet now. No more storms. No more tremors. But I could still feel it. Something whispering in the back of my mind, something that had taken root in my mind the moment we set foot on that planet. "We're away from the planet," I said finally, forcing the words out. "But safe? I don't know." Claire frowned but didn't press the issue. She could feel it too, I was sure of it. Vindex 7 hadn't let us go entirely, that part of it was still with us. I stared out the viewport, watching the planet grow smaller and smaller until it was just a pinprick in the distance. As the shuttle drifted through the vacuum of space, I leaned back in my seat, trying to relax, trying to tell myself that it was over, that we'd won. But the whispers were there. The planet was still with us. I set a course for home, whatever that meant, Earth or wherever the company decided to send us next. But as the stars stretched out before us, one thing was clear. Vindex 7 wasn't a place we would ever truly leave behind. It was alive, and now so was its influence, buried somewhere deep inside us, waiting. I just hoped we'd never go back. Months later, I was back on Earth, sitting in the whitewashed room of a debriefing facility owned by the company that sent us to Vindex 7. The chair beneath me was rigid and uncomfortable, just another reminder that I was in a place where humanity was stripped down to its most utilitarian parts. Everything here was designed to get answers, not to offer comfort. The three of us, Claire, Sarah, and I, were the last ones left. The others, those few who had made it off the planet with us, hadn't survived the journey home. One by one, they'd succumbed to the psychological scars, the endless whispers they couldn't shut out. One of them, a technician named Harris, had sealed himself in the airlock of our transport ship, mumbling something about cleansing the contamination before he jettisoned himself into space. I never forgot the look he gave when he pressed that button. His face frozen in shock, as if he was seeing something out there in the void. Claire and Sarah were holding on barely. They sat beside me, both silent, their eyes fixed on some invisible point in the room. They'd been talking less and less since we returned, lost in their own thoughts, wrestling with whatever piece of Vindex 7 was still lodged in their minds. The door opened and 2 corporate representatives walked in, crisp suits and faces that could have been carved from stone. They didn't waste time with pleasantries or condolences. To them, the people we lost on Vindex 7 were just numbers on a ledger. They were here for data, for facts, for the bottom line. "Mr. Mercer," the taller of the two said, flipping open a tablet with our mission's details. "We need a comprehensive debrief on the events that transpired on Vindex 7, from the start of the mission to the moment of your departure." I took a slow breath, my hands gripping the arms of my chair to stop them from shaking. "You read the preliminary report, didn't you? It's all in there. The equipment failures, the storms, the seismic anomalies." "Yes, we did," the second one said. "But what we need to understand is why the mission failed. Why a planet designated as an ideal candidate for terraforming resisted all attempts to alter its environment. What went wrong, Mr. Mercer?" I met his eyes and considered telling them everything. The truth about the planet's consciousness, about how it manipulated us, about the voices that still whispered in my head. But I knew what they'd do with that information. They'd send more teams, more machines, more people who thought they could control something that didn't want to be controlled. "It was the equipment," I said finally. "It wasn't calibrated properly for the conditions on Vindex 7. We underestimated the geological instability. The planet's magnetic fields were stronger than we anticipated, and that interfered with the terraforming process. That's what caused the malfunctions. That's why we lost control." The 2 men exchanged a glance, nodding as if that answer fit neatly into their report. To them, it was just another technical error to be corrected in the next mission. "And the crew?" the taller one asked. "What happened to the rest of your team?" "They didn't make it," I said. "The stress, the psychological impact, it was too much. We lost them before we could get back to Earth." "And what of the planet itself?" The second one's voice was softer now, almost probing. "Do you believe Vindex 7 is still a viable candidate for future terraforming missions?" I knew what they wanted me to say. They wanted to hear that the planet was a challenge, but one that could be conquered with better technology, with more preparation. They wanted me to tell them that all they had to do was throw more money and resources at it, and it would bend to their will. But I couldn't lie. Not about this. "Vindex 7 isn't just a planet," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "It's alive. It's aware of us, and it will fight back against any attempt to change it. Sending another team out there would be a mistake. It won't let us win." The 2 men stared at me. I could tell they were weighing my words, calculating whether I was another survivor cracking under pressure, or if there was something more to my warning. Finally, the taller one gave a curt nod, making a note on his tablet. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Mercer," he said, though there was a hint of skepticism in his tone. "We'll take your report under advisement." They turned to leave, the door sliding shut behind them. Claire and Sarah hadn't said a word the entire time, but now Claire turned to me, a small, sad smile on her face. "Do you think they'll listen?" I shook my head, staring at the door. "No, they won't. They never do." We sat there in silence, the reality of it sinking in. They would send more teams, more machines, more lives to be consumed by that planet. Because to them, Vindex 7 was just a resource, a rock with potential, a puzzle to be solved. We left the facility, stepping out into the cold air of the city. I glanced at the sky, the stars distant and unblinking, and I knew that somewhere out there, Vindex 7 was watching. It would remember us, just as we would never forget it. And if we were foolish enough to go back, it would be ready. I had told them not to go back. I had told them to leave Vindex 7 alone. But I knew that they wouldn't listen. And one day, someone would stand where I had stood, feel what I had felt. The whispers, the pressure, the presence of something utterly incomprehensible. And they would understand that some places in the universe were never meant to be conquered. They were meant to be feared.